Hey guys, and welcome to the Fish Room. I'm Rachel O'Leary and it's time for a Tuesday tip. This week I thought we would revisit fact or fiction and talk about the inch per gallon rule. Now this is a highly controversial rule that is generally accepted to be completely inaccurate. And that's for a few reasons. I mean, it seems like basic common sense would tell us that a 10-inch Oscar won't fit in a 10-gallon tank. Yet, for some reason, it has persisted over the years as a stocking guideline and can be exceptionally dangerous not only for your fish, but also for the health of your aquarium and your longevity in the hobby. Now, it seems like common sense to know that a 10-inch fish wouldn't fit in a 10-gallon tank, yet that's exactly what that rule implies. I think that trying to use a stocking guideline like that is one of the biggest reasons for failure, especially with newer hobbyists. But there are a few things that we can do in order to apply that rule so it makes a little more sense. However, no matter what, stocking your aquarium comes down to a bit of research and a lot of common sense. So one of the most common adaptations of that inch per gallon rule is to make it a unit of total measure. That is, to make it a cubic inch. So you would multiply the fish's total length by the height, by the girth, in order to come up with a more reasonable number. Now, I did a little bit of math for you guys just to give you some examples. So for instance, this would mean my gar, which is about 18 inches or so in length, obviously is not going to fit into an 18-gallon aquarium. However, if we multiply 18 inches by about 4 inches by about 3 inches, it means he needs a 220-gallon tank, which is way more reasonable. However, it's important to take into consideration more than just the size of the fish for the gallons. For instance, with gars, they require a lot of turning space because their body's very rigid. That means that the aquarium needs to be bigger front to back than the fish is. So you have to take that into consideration as well. Now, for something like the chili rasboras that are super tiny, they're about 1.25 inches long, 1/4 inch tall, and 1/4 inch deep, which means they require about 0.08 gallons of tank space each. So being able to fit 10 to 12 in a 10 gallons sounds pretty reasonable. And if you've ever kept that fish, you know that that works out. So that guideline is a lot more appropriate when we're talking about our more generalized community fish. Another important thing to consider is that stocking isn't just based on your volume. There's a lot of factors that absolutely have to be taken into consideration when we're choosing fish for our aquarium. Their social behavior, their diet, their oxygen needs, the filtration that you're going to be able to provide, as well as just the overall bioload of a fish. And what that means is how much do they eat, how frequently do they eat, and how much waste do they produce. A good example of this would be something like a pleco. They are not always the largest fish, however, because of the way that they eat, which is almost constantly, they're known to produce a lot of waste. Another good example would be something like an apple snail or a mystery snail. They graze constantly and are known to produce an abundant quantity of fecal matter. That means they need more dilution or water space than a comparably sized fish. Now, originally I was going to set up a bunch of 10-gallon tanks and put fish that were inappropriately sized into them, but I figured you guys were smarter than that and that you could grasp the concept that there's more to this formula than meets the eye. Another example that I really wanted to bring up was something like the Asian Hillstrom species. Now, the ones like I have in my 150, for instance, the Stiffodons, are very small fish, only about 1.5 inches long, very thin, not very tall, but because of their dietary needs, them being off-flux grazer, grazing on algae and biofilm that forms in the aquarium, they require a much larger tank than similarly sized fish just so that we can provide the correct environment for them. As I mentioned in a lot of my species spotlights, especially with the smaller sized fish, it's exceptionally important to be able to keep them in adequately sized groups. This can be an obstacle in a small aquarium, so in my opinion, as I've said many times, it's always better to go bigger in your aquarium than smaller. And really do your research. Find out what your fish need. Do they need to be in groups? Are they better alone? What do they eat? How do they eat? And choose your stocking based on that instead of trying to find a hard and fast rule, because even the cubic inch of tank space is not an absolute rule. It can be useful as a rough guideline for stocking our aquariums. Anyway, let me know what you guys think below. What rules do you use to stock your aquariums? A good example of the flawed logic of the inch per gallon rule are both things pictured here, Ancestris plecos as well as shrimp. Now, Ancestris can get to 5 inches, but you certainly wouldn't want to keep them in a 5-gallon aquarium. You see, they have extra long digestive tracts in order to process the food that they graze on, and this means that they produce a ton of waste, so more space is definitely better. Conversely, shrimp can get to 1.25 inches, but that does not mean you can only stock 1 per gallon. They have an extremely low bio load, are very petite, and do quite well in extremely small aquariums. Another good example of where common sense has to come into play is with dwarf cichlids. Fish like shell dwellers are often thought to be well appropriate to keep in a very small aquarium. However, because of their social hierarchy and their propensity towards sparring during spawning, they really are much easier to keep in more space. This also applies to fish like Apistogrammas, Pelvicochromis, Leioticara, and all the other dwarf species of cichlid from all over the world. In general, I find it's best to give them more space in order for them to adequately show us their social hierarchy and to prevent fighting. Not only this, but the added dilution of the waste really makes their fry grow out much better. One should also take into consideration breeding. For instance, with guppies, while they are a small fish, we all know guppies breed very readily, so it's important to allow space for the colonies to develop and grow over time. The same thing goes for shrimp. While it's true that about 10 shrimp can fit per gallon, it's really a smart idea to leave a lot of room for the colonies to reproduce. Now, there are some exceptions as to when overstocking is appropriate. One time is when you're setting up a breeding tank when the adult fish are going to be in there for a short duration of time simply for you to gather eggs. Another is with fish like these baby polypterus. I'm growing them out in a 20-gallon tank simply because it makes it easier to feed them. So often for young fish, it is well appropriate to keep them in a tank that you would not keep them in long term. However, you should always have a plan for when they get to their larger adult size. I think we can all agree that the inch per gallon rule just takes some common sense. It's absolutely obvious that this big Oscar would not do well in a 10 or 20 gallon aquarium. And using that cubic measurement certainly makes things more accurate, but it's not an end-all, be-all rule that we can follow. You have to take into consideration the social hierarchy, the breeding, the feeding, and the digestive habits, as well as, you know, whether they're schooling or not, before we can make the right decisions for our aquarium. And as always, research is best, and never be afraid to ask questions of more experienced hobbyists. Make sure you are subscribed and you've hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of my upcoming videos. Stop by my Instagram, my Facebook, and my website, MsJinx.com, where you can find my upcoming speaking engagements, my current stock list, and information on all things nano.